sun, sea, sand, sex, hubris, jealousy, intrigue, revenge, gossip, man-eating monsters, pigs, petty, capricious beings with a complete absence of any moral centre. That's right, today on The Politics of Fiction we are previewing the new season of Love Island. No, actually we're just going to talk about a book, as usual. We are people of culture, after all. Although, honestly, if you indulge in reality TV in order to salve the psychic wounds inflicted on you by the drudgery of our capitalist hellscape, no judgment. Well, maybe a little judgment. Welcome to The Politics of Fiction. I'm Darren. I look at literature through a political lens, and today we're talking about Circe by Madeline Miller. So let's do a quick review, as usual, before we get into the politics. So this was a reread for me. I read it a few years ago and I loved it, and I loved it again this time around. I think this book is a masterpiece. The story is told from the point of view of Circe, a minor goddess and a witch who appears briefly in the Odyssey. In this novel, Miller humanizes Circe, fleshes her out, adds depth. And above all else, the book is definitely a character study of this woman. Miller draws not only on the Odyssey, but also plenty of other Greek literature and mythology. So while this story is a reimagining of sorts, it's also faithful to the world of Greek myth and to the substance of the Greek epic. The tale is vividly told. Circe's voice is subtle and artfully rendered, so much so that it is believable that we're reading the words of a divine being. The book is beautifully written and full of gorgeous imagery, and Miller expertly weaves this tapestry of pain and longing and regret, of power and malice and caprice, of identity and the journey of self-knowledge and self-acceptance, of transformation, magic, immortality, and ultimately of redemption, hope, and love. So overall, Circe is a wonderful novel, the kind of book I would recommend to anyone, and indeed it is often my go-to book to give to people as a gift. I think I've bought it for 4 or 5 different people. So in terms of the plot, the book is not absolutely chock full of action and adventure the way the Odyssey is. It's very much a character-driven book. So we follow Circe from her birth through her adolescence as a young goddess, and then most of the novel takes place on Aeaea, the island to which she's banished. She does leave the island occasionally throughout the book, and she also receives a lot of visitors, Odysseus being the primary among them. But really, the plot is not too complex or too important. It's all about the character of Circe, the things that happen to her, how she reacts, how she grows, and so on. So let's talk about the characters, and naturally we'll start with Circe. Later we'll get into how this character is reinterpreted compared to previous portrayals of Circe. But just as a standalone character, even without that context, Circe is compelling, and her story and her voice really carry the novel. Circe comes from a complicated family, let's say. Her early years are fairly wretched and miserable, and her overriding feeling is one of not belonging. This environment leaves her desperate for any kind of companionship, and so when she meets a mortal man, she falls in love, becomes obsessed with him, and she ends up transforming him into a god. Later, she transforms the woman that he rejected Circe for into a monster, and for these acts she is punished with exile. So we have this immature, naive character who is suddenly isolated from everything that she has known and forced to confront herself and try to figure out her place in the world. And in some ways she thrives, like learning how to master witchcraft. But then in other ways she is subjected to more hardship, like when she is sexually assaulted by a bunch of sailors, which is a moment that completely changes her. It makes her colder, more ruthless, more like the other gods, more like her family, whom she resents tormented so much. Later in the novel, Circe manages to carve out some happiness for herself. The second half of the book is a lot more about her giving herself over more and more to family and love, as she continues to figure out what it is exactly that she wants, and how she fits into this world of divinities and mortals. And then the ending is perfect for her character. It's entirely fitting, and it rounds out her story in a very satisfying way. The way Miller paints the character of Circe, the realism in her voice, the depth of feeling that's there, the empathy she evokes, it really is masterfully done. Unquestionably one of the great female characters of fantasy literature and of literature in general, I would say. The other major character we meet is of course the eponymous hero of the Odyssey, who is coincidentally named Odysseus. When we first see him in the novel, Odysseus is in many ways the same man that we see in Homer's epic. He's wily, clever, persuasive, charismatic, arrogant. Seeing him through Circe's eyes is really interesting. She describes him as a spiral shell, always another curve out of sight. She also refers to him as something torn that she can mend. And the relationship between them is really nicely told. Circe says of it, "He showed me his scars, and in return he let me pretend that I had none." However, Circe doesn't show all of herself to him. She hides her true self to a certain extent in order to accommodate him, to please him, to keep him there with her. And because she gets so attached to him, she sees him only partially as well. Later in the book, she acknowledges that she had overlooked some of his more unsavory qualities and deeds, seeing his ruthlessness as pragmatism, for example. We later learn that Odysseus's final years were marred by paranoia, rage, selfishness, the pursuit of further glory, all to the detriment of his family. I really like what Miller did with this character because essentially he does all the same things that he did in Homer's epic poem. We're just seeing it all from a slightly less rose-tinted perspective. All that deceit and violence and brutality is a lot less impressive, a lot less heroic, when you separate it from the context of the epic hero's tale. That lens of morality and empathy that the character of Circe provides gives us a glimpse of the reality of men of great deeds like Odysseus, and that's really refreshing. There are a few other interesting characters in the novel. I won't go into too much detail on them, but we have Circe's son, Telegonus, the master craftsman, Daedalus, and Odysseus's wife and son, Penelope and Telemachus. They are all very well drawn, and it's always entertaining to read Circe's observations of other people's behavior, and then her own struggle to figure people out, to discover what they want of her, and how she should interact with them. It's nice to see her grow and become more comfortable with other people and with herself, as her relationships develop over the course of the novel. One final thing to mention about the characters is Miller's depiction of the gods, but we'll come back to that in more detail later when we talk about power and morality. Let's talk about the writing. I think Miller's prose is the strongest feature of the novel. It is ornate, lyrical, sumptuous, and it flows effortlessly like water throughout the course of the book. I have seen so many writers attempt this kind of high register, fluid, poetic prose, and more often than not it just falls flat or it comes across as too purple, too overwrought. Miller is, in my opinion, one of the finest prose writers around at the moment in any genre. She has a particular gift for metaphor and simile, and what I love most about them is that they are all of the world of the novel, comparing things to a lyre string or the juice of an olive or the deck of a ship. In this way, her descriptive imagery reinforces the world building, as if the elements of classical Greece are seeping into the language. Here are a few nice examples. My father glowed, bright as just forged bronze. His eyes were sharp as the eagle he was named for, and could pry into all the cracks of things, like water pricking at a leaky hull. His expressions darted like schools of fish in the water, now light, now dark. The curve of her wrist had been like a swan's neck. They circled him like bees would their hive. And speaking of world building, let's talk about that for a minute. Miller's world building reminds me a lot of Ursula Le Guin's, where things are not over-explained. We get the tip of the iceberg and we can imagine the rest. It is subtle and very effective. I think Circe's voice as the narrator really helps to build up an image of this world of gods and mortals and war and nature, that ambience of divinity that she has, that slight detachment and aloofness. But then again, there's a wonderful intimacy to some of her descriptions of earth and herbs and water and animals and her son and her lovers. The language, the dialogue, the tone, everything in Miller's writing feeds the world building, making it a wholly immersive experience. And yet we're not bombarded with terminology. It never feels like she's showing off. It all feels natural. You can perceive Miller's expert knowledge of the classics, and every detail is credible, whether it's on the subject of plants or animals or shipcraft, or even the more mythical, fantastical elements, like how the palaces of the gods were decorated. The world that Miller creates is rich, believable, and enchanting, and it's one that you don't want to leave when you get to the end of the book, which is really the highest praise one can give. So, let's get into the politics of the novel. We'll start by talking about the feminism of the book, especially in the context of Greek myth. So, one thing to mention first briefly, and I talked about this at length in my video on the secret history, so I won't go into too much detail on it again, but just to say that the classics in general has become a focal point for a lot of kind of male, white, Western, patriarchal perspectives. You see a lot of stuff online about classical culture, aesthetics, civilization, and a lot of it is appropriated as kind of manosphere culture war messaging. And I think this is maybe one of the reasons why Miller's feminist approach with this novel really struck a chord. But leaving that aside, more importantly, I think, is simply the material, textual reason that in the Odyssey, and many works of classical myth and classical literature, there aren't that many fleshed out female characters. Those stories are very much about the deeds of men. And often when we do get female characters in ancient Greek literature, they are passive wives, or compliant slave girls, or insane, bloodthirsty harpies like Medea, horny trickster witches like Calypso. There's an interesting comment that I found from Madeline Miller on the character of Circe and how she fits into this context. So Miller says, Circe has been portrayed as a two-dimensional villain in most post-Homeric works. In the Odyssey itself, however, she's actually a much more balanced and complex character. Yes, she's frightening, and yes, she turns men to pigs, but after she and Odysseus become lovers, she offers to help him and his men, giving them shelter and helping them heal from their griefs for an entire year. Her house is the only place in the Odyssey that Odysseus doesn't agitate to leave. His men have to come and remind him that it's time to go. Then, when he tells her he's leaving, Circe doesn't try to keep him, nor even complain about his going. She instead offers him vital help and advice on the difficult road ahead. She ends up, in fact, being one of the most helpful people he encounters. So I think it's very interesting that she's been made into such a villain. It has much more to say about our fear of powerful women than it does about Homer's poetry. So even when a character like Circe comes along, who is a rare exception, a relatively strong, benevolent female character, we get this reinterpretation of her that paints her as one of these typical villainous, scheming women. And I'm sure that Miller, and any other woman working in the classics, would tell you that a lot of that is down to the predominantly male perspective in the field, both in terms of authors and scholars. There's even a nice line in the novel from Circe about the portrayal of women in the Greek epics. Humbling women seems to me a chief pastime of poets, as if there can be no story unless we crawl and weep. So let's talk about the novel as a feminist text. The world Circe inhabits is patriarchal. It is dominated by men, and it is a difficult place to be a woman. The way the male gods see the female gods, for example, is purely transactional. How can they be of benefit to us? How can we use them? We see this in how Circe is treated by her father and her brother. We also have Glaukos, the mortal man that Circe transforms into a god, who shuns her and shows his callousness and misogyny quite clearly once he has the power to indulge in them. Hermes is another god who takes advantage of Circe and uses her for his own entertainment. Here is Circe talking about how she and the other nymph goddesses are viewed. Brides, nymphs were called, but that is not really how the world saw us. We were an endless feast laid out upon a table, beautiful and renewing, and so very bad at getting away. And it's not just the male gods who dominate the world. Mortal men are shown to subject women, even divine women, to misogyny, oppression, violence. Early in the story, Circe recognizes this in the attitude of a sailor. She says, "I would come to know this type of man, jealous of his little power, to whom I was only a woman. Of course, the most egregious example of this male behavior towards women is when Circe is raped. It's a very powerful scene, horrifying, obviously, and sensitively written, and the overwhelming feeling is one of powerlessness. Even a deity is powerless when faced with the violence of men. Odysseus serves as another example of the way men treat women, as he manipulates Circe into serving the needs of him and his men. And even the way Circe later recognizes his true character, as we mentioned already, is an example of her kind of feminist awakening. I think there's also a metatextual point being made there about the classics and how they're interpreted. Kind of a, no, I'm sorry, I'm tired of pretending this guy is just a legend and a hero. He's a bit of a dickhead. So we have this patriarchal world, and we have a main character who suffers various ills and misdeeds at the hands of the men in her life. So how does she react to all this? Is this a revenge tale? Badass witch goddess seeks justice kind of thing? There's a little bit of that, certainly, when Circe embraces her witchy ways and becomes a swineherd for a while. But this story is not so crude. There's much more nuance here than some simple blood-drenched revenge fantasy. Justice would be nice, of course, but it's often unattainable. And Circe's vengeful acts only turn her into something that she despises. So what can we do in the face of a hostile world? How should we act when subjected to injustice? Miller and Circe definitely feel that some defiance is necessary in scorning and rejecting the patriarchy. And we see that clearly when Circe confronts her father for the last time. But crucially, Circe's salvation lies in embracing love and empathy, because that's how she manages to escape the world that was thrust upon her and shape a new world for herself. Early in the novel, Circe has the first realization of her autonomy. She says, "All my life had been murk and depths, but I was not a part of that dark water. I was a creature within it." Now, she goes on to learn a lot more about the world and herself after that. She spends so much of the novel wallowing in the weaknesses that she was always told that she had, suffering the fate that had been decided for her. But as she lives and matures and understands more of the world, from her talents, her experiences, her mistakes, her relationships, her pride, her love, her self-acceptance, she derives a strength and an independence and a fierceness of spirit that never would have been expected from her. And that is Circe's ultimate feminist revenge. Not turning men into pigs, but facing a world full of pigs and saying defiantly, I am going to create a happy life for myself. As a mother, as a lover, as a witch, as a woman, and I'm not going to let any of you take that away from me. And we get this lovely line that sums up Circe's feelings on womanhood. It is a common saying that women are delicate creatures. Flowers, eggs, anything that may be crushed in a moment's carelessness. If I had ever believed it, I no longer did. Let's talk about power and morality. So clearly the most obvious cast of characters to discuss here are the gods. The pantheon of Greek gods has been represented countless times in culture, whether it's in the rather dry Robert Graves books on Greek myth, or movies like Disney's Hercules, video games like Hades. I think everyone probably has an image in their head of gods like Zeus and Poseidon. They are mostly depicted as immensely powerful beings who are often incredibly cruel and vindictive, and who enjoy meddling in human affairs despite seeing humans as much lesser creatures. I did read an interesting theory somewhere that the idea of the Greek gods wasn't that they were all just completely and unreasonably malicious, but rather that they were truly emblematic personifications of what they represented. Zeus is a king. He represents royalty, so he does what he wants. He abuses his power. Artemis represents nature, so she is harsh, uncaring. Hades represents death, so he kidnaps people and takes them to the underworld. Either way, they're not the most benevolent bunch of deities. So let's talk about Miller's representation of these gods, which is one of the best I've come across in any kind of mythical or fantasy literature. I think it is very difficult to represent the Greek gods in a serious novel without them coming across as cheesy or overdone or just plain ridiculous, or maybe just underplaying their power, focusing on their bitchiness or whatever, but not conveying the immensity of their divinity. Miller manages to infuse these divine beings with great stature and power and ferocity, but she also shows us their self-importance, their capricious nature, their pettiness, their love of gossip and interfering, and their complete lack of moral scruples. She says at one point that the gods are children, clapping and shouting for more. Her descriptions of her father, Helios, the god of the sun, are particularly potent and expressive. She really captures the ferocious magnitude of his fury and wrath and contempt, and also just how much of an enormous pompous asshole he is. Circe has a few great lines about her father, but my favorite is, "He was a harp with only one string, and the note it played was himself." That's pretty devastating. So the most important aspect of the gods' behavior and character is their power. Circe herself marvels over the potential of her witchcraft when she begins to use it. She says, "I learned that I could bend the world to my will, as a bow is bent for an arrow. I thought, this is how Zeus felt when he first lifted the thunderbolt." And throughout the book, we are shown that power is a destructive force, both in terms of destroying the lives of those who fall victim to it, as well as damaging the wielder of the power, making them miserable and corrupting their morality. If you look at the history of the Titans and the Olympians, for example, which Circe sketches out for us, you see the fear and paranoia that grips gods like Kronos, one of the most powerful beings in the universe, and yet he feels he has to eat his children because he fears what they may become. What a drama queen. We see Helios, Circe's father, indulge in the same kind of outbursts of wrath and power because he fears conflict with Zeus. He has Prometheus punished, he exiles his own daughter. All of his own abilities, great as they are, don't really protect him in any way or give him peace of mind, because he lives in constant fear of losing power. We see more examples of this flagrant use of power to exert authority or to bend the world to the will of the gods in Circe's siblings, all three of whom are shown to be decadent, violent, spoilt brats, basically. So for these supremely powerful beings, the idea of morality, of right and wrong, can just be completely ignored. Why would they need to abide by any such code when they have such unchecked power? We see the damaging effects of irresponsible use of power in Circe herself, when she transforms Scylla into a monster who ends up devouring countless sailors. And Circe carries the remorse for that action with her throughout her life. She also becomes something she never wanted to be, as we mentioned, when she starts turning the men into pigs, becoming more like her father and her siblings, this cold, wrathful goddess over whom morality has no purchase. A common event in Greek mythology is divine intervention, the gods deciding, in their boredom presumably, to tinker and meddle in the affairs of mortals or indeed of lesser gods. Circe is the victim of the unwanted attentions of Athena, among others, and she tells us how this makes her feel trapped. "Every moment of my peace was a lie, for it came only at the gods' pleasure. No matter what I did, how long I lived, at a whim they would be able to reach down and do with me as they wished." Some of the gods have their favorite human, favorite man usually, whom they decide to bless with their favor. And of course what that normally means is they help him to murder a bunch of people more efficiently. We see this in the relationship between Athena and Odysseus. Sometimes the intervention is direct, sometimes it may take the form of protection, at other times it may just be imbuing him with confidence. But of course, the gods are fickle, and they are liable to abandon or even turn on any mortal who displeases them, who doesn't follow the path that they have prescribed for them. This is also linked to prophecy, another gift of the gods to humanity, deciding and then ensuring the destiny, often tragic, of certain people, taking their agency from them, controlling them, essentially, like puppets. Circe talks about the gods who weave such stories with people's lives. "The fates were laughing at us. It was their favorite bitter joke. Those who fight against prophecy only draw it more tightly around their throats." So again, we see the complete lack of any kind of moral code from these powerful divinities. For Circe, the power and the lack of morality are linked, and this leads her to resent her godhead. Odysseus says of her that he had never met a god who enjoyed their divinity less. And at the end of the book, Circe makes the decision to abandon that power and control and all of its attendant fear and paranoia and immorality in favor of happiness and a simple life. Which brings us on to our final subject, identity. Circe spends the entire novel trying to come to terms with her own identity. The opening line of the book is perfect. "When I was born, the name for what I was did not exist." Later, she says that her life truly began when she stepped into those woods and discovered witchcraft. But she still had a long way to go, and the key theme that sits alongside and is woven through identity in the novel is transformation. Circe has the ability, with her spells, to reveal someone's true identity and to transform transform them into that true version of themselves. But we see that there's a difference between physical transformation and real change. Circe even mentions that the animals she transforms don't know how to act in their new bodies. A fish turned into a sheep will continue to try to swim. Circe transforms Glaukos and Scylla into their true selves, but again, this isn't changing their essence, it's only revealing it. She transforms many sailors into pigs over the years because she sees all men as pigs. But then men like Odysseus and Daedalus and her son and Telemachus show her that this isn't the case. At the end of Circe's story, she herself has been transformed, in a sense, because of her experiences, because of her journey of self-knowledge and self-acceptance. But again, it's not really transformation so much as growth and discovery. She finally realizes that her divinity doesn't suit her, and being transformed into a mortal won't change her essence. It will just allow her to be what she has always felt like. And that's a really nice message that can obviously be applied to a lot of contemporary issues, like trans people and their wish to have their physical appearance match the people that they are. These changes don't transform them, they simply affirm who they are. Circe says we are not our blood when she breaks from the path of divinity, when she decides that she doesn't want to be like her family and she doesn't want to be what her family expects her to be. She says tear down and build again, when she decides that she needs to construct the life that she wants to live. And at the end, she accepts and embraces the frailty and vulnerability of her new existence. Circe, he says, it will be all right. It is not the saying of an oracle or a prophet. They are words you might speak to a child. I have heard him say them to our daughters when he rocked them back to sleep from a nightmare, when he dressed their small cuts, soothed whatever stung. His skin is familiar as my own, beneath my fingers. I listen to his breath, warm upon the night air, and somehow I am comforted. He does not mean that it does not hurt. He does not mean that we are not frightened, only that we are here. This is what it means to swim in the tide, to walk the earth and feel it touch your feet. This is what it means to be alive. This is a woman who, once she discovers her own identity, uses her will and her abilities to shape the world for herself, to carve out the life that she wants, to wrench from a hostile universe the conditions that she needs in order to flourish and to be happy. And that, more than any witchy spell or divine trickery or display of godly wrath, is badass. And it's something we could all learn from. Okay, that's it for Circe by Madeline Miller. Thank you very much for watching. If you'd like more content, you can check out my Patreon. The link is in the description. Half of my videos are going up there at the moment. Other than that, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. And I'll see you back here soon for another video. Take care of yourselves. Good luck.